And now for chapter 12, Through the Stable Door. Jill ought to have been back at the White Rock already, but she had quite forgotten that part of her orders in the excitement of watching the fight. Now she remembered. She turned at once and ran to it and arrived there barely a second before the others. It thus happened that all of them, for a moment, had their backs to the enemies. They all wheeled around the moment they had reached it. A terrible sight met their eyes. A color marine was running toward the stable door, carrying something that kicked and struggled. As it came between them and the fire, they could clearly see the shape of a man, the shape of what it carried. It was Eustace. Tyrion and the unicorn rushed out to rescue him, but the color marine was now far nearer the barn door than they. Before they had covered half the distance, he had flung Eustace in and shut the door on him. Half a dozen more color marines had run up behind him. They formed a line to open on the open space before the stable. There was no getting at it now. Even when Jill remembered to keep her face turned aside, well away from her bow, even if I can't stop blubbering, it won't get my string wet, she said. Wear arrows, said Podgen suddenly. Everyone ducked and pulled his helmet well over his nose. The dogs crouched behind, but though a few arrows came their way, it soon became clear they were not being shot at. Griffel and his dwarves were at their archery again. At this time, they were coolly shooting at the color marines. Keep it up, boys, said Griffel's voice. All together, carefully. We don't want the darkies any more than we want the monkeys or the lions or the kings, or the dwarfs are for the dwarfs. Whatever else you may say about dwarfs, no one can say they aren't brave. They could easily have gone to some safer place, preferred to stay and kill as many of both sides as they could, except when both sides were kind enough to save them the trouble by killing one another. They wanted Narnia for their own. What perhaps they had not taken into account was that the color marines were mail-clad and the horses had no protection. Also, the color marines had a leader. Rishda Tarkin's voice cried out, 30 of you, keep watch on these fools by the White Rock. The rest after me. We may reach those sons of Earth, teach those sons of Earth a lesson. Tyrion and his friends, still panting from their fight and thankful for a few minutes' rest, stood and looked on while the Tarkin led his men against the dwarfs. It was a strange scene. By now, the fire had sunk lower, and the light it gave was now less and of a darker red. As far as one could see, the whole place of assembly was now empty, except for the dwarves and the color marines. In that light, one couldn't make out much of what was happening, and it sounded like the dwarves were putting up a good fight. Tyrion could hear Griffel using dreadful language, and every now and then the Tarkin calling, take all you can alive, take them alive. Whatever the fight may have been like, it did not last long. The noise of it died away. Then Jill saw the Tarkin coming back to the stable. 11 men followed him, dragging 11 bound dwarves. Whether the others had also all been killed, or whether some of them had got away, was never known. Throw them into the shrine of Tosh, said Rishda Tarkan. And when the 11 dwarfs, one after the other, had been flung or kicked into that dark doorway, and the door had been shut again, he bowed low to the stable and said, these also are for thy burnt offering, Lord Tosh. And all the color marines banged on the flats of their swords, on their shields, and shouted, Tosh, Tosh, the great god Tosh, inexorable Tosh. There's no nonsense about Toshlan now. While the party by the White Rock watched these doings and whispered to one another, they found a trickle of water coming down from the rock, and all began to drink eagerly. Jill and Podgen and the king in their hands, while the four-footed ones lapped from a little pool which was made at the foot of each stone. Such was their thirst that it seemed the most delicious drink they had ever had in their lives, and while they were drinking, they were perfectly happy and could think of nothing else. I feel it in my bones, said Podgen. that we shall all, one by one, pass through that dark door before morning. And I think of 100 deaths I would rather have died. It is indeed a grim door, said Tyrion. It is more like a mouth. Oh, can't we do anything to stop it, said Jill in a shaken voice. Nay, fair friend, said Jewel, nosing her gently. It may be for us the door to Aslan's country, and we shall sup at his table tonight. Rishda Tarkan turned his back on the stable and walked away slowly to the pace in front of the white rock. Hearken, he said, if the boar and the dogs and the unicorn will come over to me and put themselves at my mercy, their lives shall be spared. The boar shall go into a cage, the Tisrock's garden, in the Tisrock's garden, the dogs to the Tisrock's kennel, and the unicorn, when I have sawn his horn off, shall draw a cart. But the eagle and the children and he who was the king shall be offered to Tosh this night. The only answer was growls. Get on, warriors, said the Tarkan. Kill the beasts and take the two-legged ones alive. And then the last battle of the last king of Narnia began. What made it hopeless, even apart from the numbers of the enemy, was the spears. The Colmarines, who had been with the apes almost from the beginning, had no spears. That's because they'd come to Narnia by ones and twos, pretending to be peaceful merchants. And of course, they'd carried no spears, for a spear is not something you can hide. The new ones must have come in later, after the ape was already strong and they could march openly. The spears made all the difference. With a long spear, you can kill a boar before you are within reach of its tusks, and a unicorn before you are in reach of his horn, if you are very quick and keep your head. And now, the leveled spears were closing in on Tyrion and his last friends. Next minute, they were all fighting for their lives. In a way, it wasn't quite so bad as you might think. When you're using every muscle to the full, ducking under a spear point here, leaping over it there, lunging forward, drawing back, wheeling round, you haven't much time to feel either frightened or sad. Tyrion knew he could do nothing for the others now. They were all doomed together. He vaguely saw the boar go down on one side of him and Jewel fighting furiously on the other. Out of the corner of one's eye, he saw, but only just saw, a big Colmarine pulling Jill away somewhere by her hair, but he hardly thought about any of these things. His only thought now was to sell his life as dearly as he could. The worst of it was that he couldn't keep the position in which he had started under the White Rock. A man who is fighting a dozen enemies at once must take his chances wherever he can, must dart in wherever he sees the enemy break or breast or neck unguarded. In a very few strokes, you get quite a distance from the spot where you began. Tyrion soon found that he was getting further and further to the right, nearer to the stable. He had a vague idea of his mind that there was some good reason for keeping away from it, but he couldn't now remember what the reason was. And anyway, he couldn't help it. All at once, everything came quite clear. He found that he was fighting the Tarkan himself. The bonfire, what was left of it, was straight in front. He was, in fact, fighting in the very doorway of the stable, for it had been opened and two Colmarines were holding the door, ready to slam it shut the moment he was inside. He remembered everything now, and he realized that the enemy had been edging him to the stable on purpose ever since the fight began. And while he was thinking this, he was still fighting the Tarkan as hard as he could. A new idea came into Tyrion's head. He dropped his sword, darted forward, and under the sweep of Tarkan's scimitar, seized his enemy by the belt with both hands and jumped back into the stable, shouting, "Come on and meet Tosh yourself." There was a deafening noise, and when the ape had been flung in, the earth shook and there was a blinding light. The Colmarine soldiers outside screamed, "Tosh! Tosh!" and banged the door. If Tosh wanted their own captain, Tosh must have him. They, at any rate, did not want to meet Tosh. For a moment or two, Tristan did not know where he was or even who he was, and then he steadied himself, blinked, and looked around. It was not dark inside the stable as he had expected. He was in strong light, and that is why he was blinking. He turned to look at Rishda Tarkan, but Rishda was not looking at him. Rishdan gave a great wail and pointed and put his hands before his face and fell flat, face downward on the ground. Tyrion looked in that direction where the Tarkan had pointed, and then he understood. A terrible figure was coming toward them. It was far smaller than the shape they had seen from the tower, though still much bigger than a man, and it was the same. It had a vulture's head and 4 arms. Its beak was open, and its eyes were blazed. The croaking voice came from its beak. It's a big animal, huh? But thou hast called me into Narnia, Rishdar Tarkin. Here I am. What hast thou to say? But the Tarkin neither lifted his face from the ground nor said a word. He was shaking like a mad man with a bad hiccup. He was brave enough in battle, but half his courage had left him earlier that night when he first began to suspect there might be a real Tosh. The rest of it left him now. With a sudden jerk, like a hen swooping to pick up a worm, Tosh pounced on the miserable Rishda and tucked him under the upper of his 2 right arms. Then Tosh turned his head sideways to fix Tyrion with one of his terrible eyes, for of course, having a bird's head, he couldn't look at you straight. But immediately from behind Tosh, a strong, calm, as summer sea voice said, "Begone, monster, and take your lawful prey at your own place in the name of Aslan and Aslan's great father, the emperor over the sea." The hideous creature vanished with the Tarkin still under his arm, and Tyrion turned to see who had spoken. And what he saw then set his heartstrings beating as if it had never beaten in any fight. 7 kings and queens stood before him, all with crowns on their heads, and all in glittering clothes. But the kings wore fine mail as well and had their swords drawn in their hands. Tyrion bowed courteously and was about to speak when the youngest of the queens laughed. He stared hard at her face and then gasped with amazement, for he knew her. It was Jill, but not Jill as he had seen her, with her face all dirt and tears and the old drill dress half slipping off one shoulder. No, now she looked cool and fresh as if she'd just come from bathing. And at first he thought she looked older, but then didn't. And all he could ever make up in his own mind at that point was that he didn't know. And then he saw the youngest of the kings was Eustace, but he was also changed, as Jill was changed. Tyrion suddenly felt awkward about coming among these people with the blood and dust and sweat of the battle still on him. Next moment, he realized he was not in the same state at all. He was fresh and cool and clean and dressed in such clothes as he would have worn for a great feast at Cair Paravel. But in Narnia, your good clothes were never uncomfortable ones. They knew how to make things that felt beautiful as well as looked beautiful in Narnia, and there was no such thing as starch or flannel or elastic to be found from one end of the country to the other. "Sire," said Jill, coming forward and making a beautiful curtsy, "let me make you known to Peter the High King over all the kings of Narnia." Tyrion had no need to ask which was the High King, for he remembered his face, though here it was far nobler from his dream. He stepped forward, sank on one knee, and kissed Peter's hand. "High King," he said, "you are welcome to me." And the High King raised him and kissed him on both cheeks, as a High King should. Then he led the eldest of the queens, but even she was not old, and there were no gray hairs on her head and no wrinkles on her cheek. She said, "Sir, this is the Lady Polly who came into Narnia on the first day, when Aslan made the trees grow and the beasts talk." He brought him next to the man whose golden beard flowed over his breast and whose face was full of wisdom. "And this," he said, "is Lord Diggory, who was with her on that day. And this is my brother, King Edmund. And this is my sister, Queen Lucy." "Sire," said Tyrion, when he had greeted all of these. If I had read the Chronicle aright, there should be another. Has not your majesty two sisters? Where is Queen Susan? My sister Susan, answered Peter shortly and gravely, is no longer a friend of Narnia. Yes, said Eustace, and whenever you've tried to get her to come talk about Narnia or do anything about Narnia, she says, what wonderful memories you have. Fancy you're still thinking about all those funny games we used to play when we were children. Oh, Susan, said Jill. She's interested in nothing nowadays except nylons and lipstick and invitations. She's always a jolly sight, too, keen on being grown up. Grown up indeed, said the Lady Polly. I wish she would grow up. She wasted all her school time wanting to be the age she is now, and she'll waste all the rest of her life trying to stay that age. Her whole idea to race on to the silliest time of one's life is quick as she can and then stop there for as long as she can. Well, don't let's talk about it now, said Peter. Look, here are lovely fruit trees. Let us taste them. And then, for the first time, Tyrion looked about him and realized how very queer this adventure was. And that's the end of chapter 12.